Once again, I would like to welcome you at our panel debate, EU and the global community. And here today we have three different experts from different backgrounds. So you have already received the program, so you can read their detailed profiles later, but let me just briefly introduce them. So here we have Sergey Lagodinsky, who will answer our questions regarding relationship between EU and North America. Then we have Krug, who is an expert in transatlantic relations and European security policy. And also we have Dr. Müller, who is an expert in relationship between EU and Turkey and also Ukraine. So let me start our panel debate from the very basic question, which is, what do you think is the recent European achievements in the field of international relationships, and if you can put it in the perspective of a specific country, which you focus on. So you can have some of you can start.
Okay, so
ladies first.
I just start ladies first, exactly.
All right.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for the invitation. I'm glad to be here today with you. I think if you would have asked that question 1 year ago, the answer would have been completely different to today. I think it's very hard to name one specific achievement of the European Union in international relations. But if I think about the broader foreign policy context, I definitely think about the Iran deal, which was a great achievement of the European Union, not only because the European Union has achieved that deal as a unified foreign policy actor with a unified EU voice at the table, but also it has a great impact on the region. But as we all know, this particular achievement has been cancelled by the new, not so new any longer, US administration. But I think that's definitely one of the examples. But in a broader context, I think that the European Union is contributing to international relations because it is international relations in itself. It is a multilateral or supranational organization. So it's contributing by existence, I think.
All right. Any other opinions? Yes?
Yeah, and I think that it's very difficult to measure success with regards to big events. Like the Iran deal is a great example, but I think the European Union is also an international context in itself, which constantly works towards the making of democratic structures and in the world. And I think this is also in the European Union itself, step by step, and works towards economic progress in all the different European countries, tries to balance wealth in the European Union and bordering countries. So I think it's really a process which goes step by step by step by step. It's not like the European Union today did something and now it's the access is there. It's rather that we have a process in which, let's say, take the extension of the European Union, the slow extension process towards the Western Balkans. I mean, also Turkey is still a candidate, even though the difficulties there are very high, or there are many difficulties. But this is not something which works overnight. It's something which takes on decades to deepen European integration.
I agree.
I think without spoiling this rosy picture that you presented, I think we have to be a little bit more modest in terms of our expectations and in terms of how much do we celebrate. And I think, to be honest, the largest tangible achievement that I've witnessed during the past months is the continued unity in the question of sanctions towards Russia. It is something which is weird to say. This is, let's celebrate that we're all for sanctions. But it is about this very fragile unity within the European Union and this perspective and this aspiration of being able to formulate a united foreign policy. This is something that we'll have to get used to this, that this is not a given. I don't believe that the project of a common foreign and security policy will be something which is easily achieved and implemented. And therefore, I was quite surprised that we are able, with Hungary, with Greece, which is a very ambivalent candidate regarding relationship vis-a-vis Russia, Cyprus, that we are still able to continue that. This is a kind of a negative example because it is about,
Penalizing.
penalizing someone. But it is, I think, kind of, it strikes a nerve. It's a topic which is able to divide countries in the European Union, and the fact that it was not the case so far, I think, shows there is a potential of a common foreign policy push.
All right.
If I may
sure.
add on this, I think it's an interesting dynamic that the EU is quite well, or performs quite well under pressure, under extreme pressure. And I think at the moment the EU is under internal pressure and under external pressure, and there is something what I would describe as integration by force or coercive integration.
Yes.
So we need to get our act together because everything around us and everything inside is changing. And then agreements like the sanctions work. So I think that's an interesting dynamic which applies to some of the other policy fields as well.
Maybe I will have a question for myself. It's not prepared, but it's an interesting topic actually. Would you consider like sanctions as something that hurts the country we're penalizing, or it also hurts ourselves in some way?
You mean ourselves?
Like,
But if Europe puts sanctions on Russia, but that
yes,
also hurts
yes.
Europe.
Yes. Do you think so, or it's only one way?
I mean, it's an intertwined world, and especially in terms of trade, certainly, especially in Germany and Eastern Germany, you would talk to people, you would talk to companies. There is a lot of, I wouldn't call it whining, but there is a lot of complaining that there is a negative impact. If you look at the statistics are not as critical as it is being portrayed, and we should also be aware of a lot of propaganda that is coming as well. Through the internet and kind of a Stimmungsmache, as they say in German, making us feel something that is probably not always there. But I do think there are questions on which sanctions work how, and whom do they put under pressure.
All right.
So targeted sanctions, I think, do have an impact, and we will have to see what the sanctions are going to be now coming from Washington. Many people say this will hurt the right people, and not the common Russian population, which is not the point.
I see. Yes.
No, and I think it's very important how these sanctions are structured, what kind of sanctions we put against whom. So, and to stand united behind those policies. Let's say in the Iran case, it's precisely the problem that if one country suddenly says, and a powerful country suddenly says, no, we don't want to have these sanctions, and no, we want to have a entirely new deal. If this unity isn't there, it becomes, of course, very difficult.
All right, so my next question will be also maybe some kind of related to what we discussed so far, but what do you think, which countries are some kind of, let's say, priority for Europe to cooperate with or to strengthen the diplomatic relationship with? Do you think it's one specific country, or why we prioritize our relationship with one country and then we don't care about relationship with other countries? So what is the measurement, or how we judge it?
It just start with a very brief comment on this one. I think I have two things in my mind right away. The one thing is, if you look at the continent of Europe, there is the fear that the eastern part of Europe and the western part of Europe, that there comes a rift. There's a rift emerging, that these two halves kind of break apart, and that there's a fear and problem, or the potential for disintegration. And I think this is one focus Europe has to concentrate on. But on the other hand, I think, which is still, even though now it becomes more visible and more people talk about this issue, but the impact of trade with China, or China's initiatives to have businesses, especially, for example, increase in Southeast Europe, but also in Eastern Europe, in many countries which are partly part of the European Union, others not. I think there is an enormous economic impact coming from China, and this has to be shaped much more proactively to make it a win-win situation in the long run.
Right.
Plus, I think that we sometimes tend to think in the extremes of the spectrum. So the US is falling apart as our closest ally, so now we need to focus on Latin America. I think it's somewhere in between. Of course, we still need to continue to work on the transatlantic relations. There are so many dependencies and still so many similarities and commonalities that we need to do that. But I think it's also interesting how the EU and also Germany is somehow surprised or overwhelmed by the question, okay, if our closest ally is falling apart when it comes to the liberal democratic world order, whom are we turning to now? And I think what is displayed in this is that the Western, so to say, Western world was very much self-centered for a long, long time and forgot to include, or not forgot, but decided to not include Latin America, Southeast Asia, a lot of African countries. So what is going on now is that the EU and also Germany, and let's talk about the EU, need to, on the one hand, focus on the transatlantic relations and on the other hand, try to bring others on board that are helping to promote or to protect our order that we are highly dependent on. So I think it's not the one side of the spectrum. It's a parallel act of building bridges.
Right.
I think to kind of try to systematize to whatever you call it, never mind. to try to put it in a kind of a logical way.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, obviously, the geostrategic proximity and just geographic proximity
Mm-hmm.
is something which is important. We are not the United States, which is safely kind of floating in the middle of oceans. We do have a large country to the east. We do have a large Muslim country and Muslim neighborhood in the south, and of course, building relationships with them, including the Balkan countries, is something that should be of priority just because it is close to us. But then we, of course, if we do the IR paradigm, you go through and you, okay, what about values? What are the countries where we share common values? That you would come probably to the United States because, maybe we don't share the values with the captain, but we share the values with the crew. And with the civil society and with people who are protesting against the captain. So there is a kind of a commonality of history and of mind, commonality of mindset that predisposes us in a certain way to cooperate with them. And obviously the end of this continuum is the interest, the common interest. Yes, we will have to see how we work with China, just because it's one of the largest trade partners, but there we will have to have trade-offs. What do you do if you have common interests but not common values? So there we will obviously have to be a little bit more cautious in terms of how we work together.
But may I ask a question? How do you assess the situation, let's say, in Greece? I mean, Greece is economically in a very difficult situation, and since, for several reasons, it is very difficult to receive the necessary support from the European Union. That's how I would, in a very general way, assess the situation. They're kind of naturally look towards Russia, towards China, and I think China is one of the biggest investors in Greece. I'm not an economist, but I think so. So how should Greece be able to really look at certain sensibilities, let's say when China is not so, or kind of violates many human rights and doesn't open its own markets? I mean, and still Greece and many other Eastern European countries do make deals with them because it's necessary, just because it's a great economic partner.
Yeah.
How shall we work towards a situation where we can put values and economic interests in line?
I mean, first of all, you can explain to the Greeks that this is not in their interest to undergo a relationship of dependency, which will last long beyond the crisis. Second, we have to understand that there is a kind of a concept of collective resilience. It's not just Greece what it is about. It is about our common positions on certain foreign policy aspects, and it's not just about dependence on China. It's also dependence on Russia. How much dependent do we want to be from Russia? And their Nord Stream 2 is obviously something that they will show us and give us a mirror to look at it and to see how much dependent we are from Russia, for example, in terms of certain relationships. So this is a kind of a two-way street. But I think the European Union, and that's we have a push for a strategy vis-a-vis China in Brussels, and the same with our relationship with Russia. We will have to agree that then Germany or other countries will have to have a more solidarity, show more economic and social solidarity vis-a-vis their Greek friends. So not so much austerity, but we're in a different discussion there. I do think though that we have to understand that this is kind of an age of resilience. We have to be clear what kind of dependencies we want to undergo and which not.
But as you mentioned resilience twice now, I think we touch upon a deficiency of the, three times actually, so we touch upon a deficiency of the European Union here, because I think the easy answer to your question also would be EU has trade competencies, so the EU is doing the deals. The downside of it is, and we just observed that right now, that the EU can't do a lot about economic resilience, because then it's about industry, it's about innovation, and this is not EU competence. So what was happening, I think, a week ago, 2 weeks ago, that a couple of member states took protective measures against Chinese investments, but not in a European coordinated way, but in a member state or in a national way. So I think there is still a gap between what competencies the European Union should have to really build economic resilience. I don't want to say against China, but in the greater context. So I think that's an interesting aspect as well.
All right. So also maybe that's some kind of related, but as we all know, nowadays we talk about superpowers, and China is one of them. Then we have Russia and United States. So what do you think, or what do you think? Is it how and in which state we are right now as Europe? Is it Europe a superpower as those mentioned countries, or what kind of steps we need to take to become one?
That's a good question.
Maybe we should first define what a superpower is, and if you can be a superpower in all policy fields at once. You should definitely look at it policy field by policy field. I think what's also important is to keep in mind the European Union can only be as powerful as the member states allow. So if we are a superpower or not is nothing which is decided in Brussels. If we look at security and defense, that's my expertise. No, we're not a superpower because we are not as powerful as other nation states on the table, such as the United States. So the answer is no in that regard, if you want an easy answer.
I don't think that the European Union is, from its structure, prone to be a superpower. I think that these are different states who engage in international contracts, international relations, international legal connections, and it's not one state or one large state with lots of manpower, with lots of technological power, and all these other, or economic power, all these other aspects which might define a superpower. And I think that Europe should promote its values, its idea of how democracy might work and function. I think that's the strength we have. I mean, that's apart from economic strength, and this could be all more orchestrated, but I don't think that Europe will become a democratic Russia or more democratic United States. I think it's going to be Europe, a European Union, and I think it has different qualities than a superpower like we know the concept from, literature from the 70s and 80s, where this concept was still real important.
All right, so also I would say that I have a feeling that, or if you are not talking about Europe as a superpower, so do you think this exactly strengthening or like tightening the diplomatic and economic relationship with other countries, that's the way how Europe gonna succeed in the future, or it should become like, let's say, more independent? So like, what is actually the importance? Like, what role or which role the diplomatic or economic relationship between with other countries in Europe. Between Europe and other countries play or have. So I'm just like maybe let's say, as you can see, Russia is more like in a defensive position when they say no, we don't need international or external relationships. They're not so that important. We can grow from our own economy. Or so, what do you think? It's like this is the model we should follow, or it's like what the way to grow as a whole, like Europe as a whole?
Russia is not growing from their own economy.
Yeah.
What do you think?
No, I mean, just I'm trying to say that, in my opinion, international relationship or economic relationship with other countries are important to build and maintain, and not to close yourself as an economy or as a country, and trying to be selective somehow in your partners. And so my question is, it's like what kind of direction should Europe take in the future in a way to become more competitive, or just to grow as Europe itself?
Well, I think I pointed at this aspect already earlier. I think Europe is currently, or I think you said it too, Europe is, from my point of view, in a phase at the moment where integration has to be deepened. I mean, we just have the Brexit still ahead of us, and when you were asking about the parallels, I was thinking about this break between several Eastern countries and Western countries of the European Union, or the rift between those states. And I think that Europe has to dramatically deepen and its inner relationships. And I think that this is one necessary precondition to, well, grow. But I mean, this can also mean that new forms of unions, I mean, that's monetary union, defense union, whatever, are kind of strengthened and deepened. So, and this also, but then means again to give sovereignty to the community. It's complex. It's difficult to go through this process.
All right. So, can you, or like, what in your opinion, which countries are potential, or in the future we should improve our relationship with? So, who is a potential partner for Europe in the future?
Maybe we can go one step back again to your previous question. I don't know if you were pointing at something in particular. I don't see tendencies that Europe is closing down or is closing against others or anything. What I see and what I think is important is that the European Union is somehow forced to emancipate from a superpower, from the United States, and that means that the EU need to become more capable in strategic action, in defining the own interests in different policy fields. And I think that also helps in what you just said. Defining the own interests is also something that unifies and that helps on the internal dimension of the European Union, but it's also something that Europe will need to navigate through international relations, to know what are our interests. And this is nothing which is contrary to promoting values. I think it's the opposite. That is something that is very much unifying. But that was your question before. So.
Yes.
But I mean, I understand what you mean. Probably, you're saying, is it worth it to stick together with the United States?
Yes.
Being dependent on that, or should we be more flexible? Should we look for maybe a Eurasian dimension or something like that? I think it's a question which is a little bit too abstract, because I don't see Eurasian dimension to bring much in terms of our assets and interests and growth. I do see multiple dependencies which are of economic and cultural nature with the United States, despite the president as it is. And if we don't ruin the transatlantic relationship within the next 4 years, or 6 years, then I do still think that there is a kind of a turf which unites us, and we should try to preserve it. But it doesn't mean, of course, this is kind of an awakening moment. It doesn't mean that we can be as dependent on the big father or mother or whatever you want to call it in Washington as we used to be. We cannot afford this anymore. And this is probably, this realization is something that makes us emancipated. And from there, it means that we should see ourselves as a strategic actor, not just a part of an alliance, a strategic actor with maybe with leadership ambitions. So, for example, I think that the proposal of our development minister to invest more in Africa is way too late, right? But it's at least at some point there is a realization on behalf of the government that we should try to do something in Africa which is not developmental aid, but which is an economic and maybe infrastructural cooperation, something that the Chinese have been doing for years, and we're probably too late on that. So this is, I think this is a question of posture, right? In Germany we have this Haltung, yeah. Everyone wants to have Haltung now, that kind of attitude, posture, and this we didn't have this posture for too long. We will have this posture, but this doesn't mean that we are totally isolated and dependent only on ourselves. We do have friends, and we do have enemies, and we do have people with whom we should be cautious about. And doesn't mean we should lie in the bed with everyone who kind of shows us some short-term benefits.
I agree, especially with regards to your comment on Africa. And apart from that, not disagreeing with anyone, but just to respond to your question, I think it also very much depends what we're talking about. For example, in order to reach a solution to the conflict in Ukraine, ultimately there won't be another chance to integrate Russia into diplomatic relations, which Russia is with regards to the Minsk protocol and the Minsk treaty. But with regards to other questions, when we talk about economic relations in Eastern Europe, yes, we will have to kind of find a way to negotiate with China how good a win-win situation can be created. And I think it really depends what policy field we look at. It's not that there is one big ally with whom we can't do anything. It's just that for different policy fields, there are different players we have to consider as important, and constantly seek for common ground and see how we can find a consensus.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. I think that's now we can have some time for questions from audience, because it was really, really, let's say, fruitful discussion, and a lot of topics we discussed. So maybe some of our audience have questions. Yes, please. So yes, yeah, you can, if you would like to answer this question. So what kind of values we actually, as a Europe, we represent and trying to combine or include to our policy?
Mm-hmm. Well, do you want to answer?
I can start with a brief answer. I think that the idea of negotiating consensus as one basic aspect of what I consider democratic interaction. I think this is something for me what is a European value. So this process of negotiating a consensus, meaning an agreement which both parties can say, yes, I'm convinced of what you said, I'm convinced of what you said, we came to a common position, and now we have a motivation to implement our plan which we negotiate together. So I'm not speaking about values in the sense of any traditions or whatever. for me, a European, or what I consider very valuable personally and also politically, is democratic deliberation. And I associate this idea with Europe. I also know that for this ideas, very brutal wars have been fought, which is indeed a problem. So we have to stay self-critical. So yes, there have been wars in the name of democracy or in the name of democratic deliberation to implement that. But still, knowing that this is not a very, that doesn't have, that this is not necessarily the most peaceful thing, democracy. I think that's something I would say, yes, I would like to say this is something I consider valuable, and I don't want to impose it on anyone, but I think that would be my way to try to reach a more peaceful way to interact in the world.
Since I mentioned this this term first, I mean, first of all, my term was not European values. Yeah, I said common values in terms of with whom we work, and there is a basis, right? You can work on the basis of common interests, but you also can work on the basis of common values, and it doesn't mean that it should be just European values, right? It could be universal values, like universal human rights. But I do think that there is this democratic deliberation is absolutely something that I think resonates with certain, and not in terms of cultural relative. Or cultural colonialism. This is not what it is about. It is about, for example, a certain understanding of a relationship between human being and the state. I think this is something that, for example, does unite us and is in common with kind of a transatlantic understanding. If you look at countries like China or even kind of the Soviet Union type societies, the place that an individual and the value of individual dignity has within the structure of a society is not kind of the primary point of at least in theory of the whole constitutional structure. And I think this is something that this is a chance, this is a gift, a present from history that was given to many European countries and to the United States through the history of liberty, revolutions, etc. And I think we should stick to it. Whether we really are true to our principles in every single decision, you asked very critically and rightly so, no. But this is our role here in terms of checks and balances to make sure that we are true to these values. And there we have questions. Do we do trade with China, which imprisons people? Do we get gas from Russia, where Sentsov is dying probably this day, at this moment, a political prisoner, and there are many political prisoners like this, and we don't even mention this. So this is a very tender, a zartes Pflänzchen, as they say in German, a tender plant, a tender flower, but this is something that we should cherish, and we should understand that this is kind of a core identity of ourselves. And if someone wants to join us, be our guest. Otherwise, the expectation that at least the human rights should be expected with all the people around the world, universally, not just European-wise. This is the premise that we have to work on.
I would like to add an inward perspective, because I think you asked that question in an interesting time. Because what is happening at the moment is that the set of values, you said we're not talking about European values, and I think that's right. The set of values that we believed were the common values of the European Union are hardly eroding at the moment. So there is a huge divide between the East and the West and the set of values that are connected towards these regions in the moment. So the rule of law is not a solid value within the European Union any longer. So we have a lot of treaty violations that the Commission is going after. So what is happening is that even within the European Union, you were talking about the external relations and how we apply our values to conflicts in the world, but even inward looking, it's not a common set of values anymore that everybody is adhering to. And we talked about it before the session. Ivan Krastev, super intellectual, great brain. He wrote something that after the reunification of Germany, or at the end of the Cold War, the Eastern European member states tried to imitate what the West already achieved. But after 20 years, 25 years, nearly 30 years of imitating, they come to this point of realization, okay, we try to be like the West, but is the West as good as we thought? Are they as great? And he's wondering that. It's a great essay. I can just recommend it. But yeah, I think that our own values and how we deal with them, it's hardly at stake at the moment.
All right. Any other questions? Yes, please.
So I have two questions. My first question relates to how easy it is to strike a balance between common interest and national interest. Especially, I think that now Brexit happened, there's this realization now that the idea of coming up with common interest can actually be more divisive, especially when there's certain countries that feel there are certain things that they feel strongly about that are not well represented in common interest. So do you think now with Brexit, it's actually a critical time for the EU to reflect more strongly on how that balance can be found and how best you can find mechanisms of negotiating the two and finding a more acceptable consensus? And then the second question relates to EU relations at the United Nations. Do you think Brexit will enhance or sort of weaken the EU's position at the United Nations as it particularly relates to security issues that are like of particular interest to everyone within the community of states?
Yes.
I mean, the obvious maybe I start with the last one.
All right.
The obvious answer on the surface is that, of course, having Great Britain out of the EU, being a Security Council member, being a nuclear power, and having a strategic security mindset that is a rare commodity within the European countries, of course, is a challenge. And when I talked to people at the UN, especially the German representatives in New York, immediately after Brexit, they had a feeling that there was an erosion of this European consent, because they used to do a lot of things of kind of pre-negotiations and negotiating a common European position for the countries like Germany, France, and the United Kingdom. There was a moment when this was not possible, but when I talk to people now, many say, and by the way, the Great Britain is still playing along. I think there is again this momentum of common positioning at the UN. We'll see what's going to happen after Brexit, but I do think that it will contribute to the fact that, for example, Germany will have a different posture, and German and French cooperation at the EU will play a larger role, and probably the role of France in the European Union will increase as the sole nuclear power. As you probably know, there is a discussion. Some people say it's a Sommerloch. It's a kind of a summer discussion because people don't have anything else to talk about the denuclearization of Germany.
Not denuclearization, unfortunately.
Renuclearization of nuclearization of Germany. But I think that this is something that we'll have to discuss about the nuclear umbrella of France and how this is going to work out without nuclearizing. As far as I talked to people at the UN, and they said there is no huge impact of Brexit for now. I don't know what you heard or no.
Germany will take over one of the non-permanent seats in 2019, and as far as I know, the agenda, it's not published in total at the moment, but they will push for a European seat again in the European Security Council. I think that's far in the future, because UN reform is horrible and not happening at the end, but I think it's at least an attempt. But otherwise, I agree with what Sergey just said. And just one brief comment to the first question, the balance between national interest and European interest. Germany has a very smart way around that and just always argues that German interests are European interests. So that's how Germany deals with that question. It's obviously not always the case, but it's again a huge problem in the European Union that some countries do benefit a lot from the European Union because the national interests are so comparable to the European interests, and then there are others who probably perceived it differently. But the German way is the easy way.
The negative result of it is that many in the European Union say that European interests are de facto German interests. So we should be careful about that, projecting that paradigm and narrative.
Yeah. But you wanted to...
No, I think I don't have to add.
That's okay. So, yeah, any questions?
One more question. I was interested to hear that you talked about the need to make the European Union more federal, so to speak. But the tendencies show that such countries as Poland, Hungary, and others do not want to be so well tied to the European Union. Yeah? And Brexit is also the tie. So aren't we disregarding the obvious signs that maybe those states need more space for their own activity within the European Union, but still the national element is very strong and cannot be ignored. What do you think about it? Thank you for your answer.
Well, maybe I can start. I think this is the big challenge in the European Union, that we have, as each single country has to give sovereignty to everyone. So we share sovereignty. We are not sovereign in several senses. When, for example, it comes to climate policies, the EU, so the European institutions in which we are represented, decide, let's say, how much emissions we can put out of our factories, etc. So there are many EU laws which are made on the EU level and which influence the people in the countries. So but it's a trade situation. So if I give sovereignty to this larger group of states, we can also achieve common goals. Let's say a fiscal union, a monetary union, the euro, a common defense strategy. I mean, also social cohesion policies. I mean, many projects in many Eastern European countries, for example, infrastructure projects are financed by the European Union. So it's not that that there's nothing to gain from working together. So, but this is one thing. So the other thing is indeed that realistically looking at the EU, the way I look at it at the moment, we see a situation where we are rather in a phase of where it's not really certain whether integration can be deepened or whether, well, yeah, I think you have been more positive there, but or whether more process of fragmentation takes place. I think that with regards to Great Britain or to the UK, but it could work like with Switzerland, like with Norwegian?
Norway.
Norway, sorry. With Norway, so that there are strong partners, countries which are not EU members, but which are still having many good relationships to the European Union. But from a certain point onwards, I think, well, it's necessary to, you can't have both. I mean, either you share responsibility and the benefits, or you say, well, I don't want to be part of that, but then there are certain benefits you don't share any longer. So that's my answer.
I think it's the question of the whole day today, or if
Yes,
you, the
so
United
if you
States
have
of Europe
exactly.
is the
So we
utopia
will
or
talk
reality.
about enlargement or the opposite, disintegration of Europe later. So you can save your questions for the next discussion. And I think our time is up. So thanks once again for attending our debate. It was really nice to hear your opinions. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So, and now, as following, we have keynote speech or lecture from Mr. Bruckner, who's going to speak about general concept of United States of Europe. So, the stage is yours.